As yet, little Ann had not balled the tree bark. We watched her. She was working everywhere. She climbed up on the rail fence and followed its zigzag course until she disappeared into the darkness. I told Papa I was sure the coon had walked the rail fence and in some way had fooled my dogs. Old Dan would keep coming back to that hackberry tree. He would rear up on it and bawl treed. We'd walk up to him, looking the river over. We could see that the coon wasn't in it. The judge said, "Looks like it has him fooled." "Maybe you'd better call him off," Grandpa said. "We can go someplace else and hunt. We've got one more coon, even if we've got to get one more coon, even if we have to tree it myself." For some reason, no one laughed at his remark. "It's almost daylight," Papa said. "Yes, that's what has me worried," I said. "We won't have time to do any more hunting. If we lose this one, we're beat." Hearing the word beat, Grandpa began to fidget. He asked me, "What do you think happened? How did that coon fool them?" "I don't know for sure," I said. "He walked that rail fence. The hackberry tree has something to do with his trick, but I don't know what." "Son," the judge said, "I wouldn't feel too badly if I were you. I've seen some of the very best hounds fooled by a smart old coon." Regardless of all this discouraging talk, the love and the belief I had in my little red hounds never faltered. I could see them now and then leaping over old logs, tearing through the underbrush, sniffing and searching for that lost trail. My heart swelled with pride. I whooped, urging them on. In a low voice, the judge said, "I'll say one thing. They don't give up easily." Birds began chirping all around us. The sky took on a light gray color. Tiny, dim stars were blinking the night away. "It looks like we're beat," Papa said. "It's getting daylight." At that moment, the loud, clear voice of a red-bone hound bawling treed rang through the river bottoms. It was the voice of little Ann. Sucking in a mouthful of air, I held it. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. I closed my eyes tight and gritted my teeth to keep the tears from coming. "Let's go get him," Grandpa said. "No, wait a minute," I said. "Why?" he asked. "Wait till old Dan gets there," I said. "It's daylight now. If we walk up to the tree, the coon will jump out. It's hard to keep a tree and a coon after daylight. Let's wait till old Dan gets there. Then if he jumps, he won't have a chance to get away." "The boy is right," the judge said. "It's hard to keep a coon in a tree after daybreak." Just then we heard old Dan. His deep voice shattered the morning silence. Searching for the lost trail, he had crossed the fence and worked his way out into an old field. Turning around, we saw him coming. He was a red blur in the gray morning shadows. Coming to the rail fence, and without breaking his stride, he raised his body into the air. About halfway over, he was still in the air. He bawled. Hitting the ground with a loud grunt, he ran past us. Everyone whooped to him. Ahead was a deep washout about 10 feet wide. On the other side was canebrake. His long red body, stretched to its fullest length, seemed to float in the air as he sailed over it. We could hear the tall stalks rattling as he plowed his way through them. A bunch of sleepy snowbirds rose from the thick cane, flitted over and settled in on the old rail fence. Nearing the tree, we could see it was a tall sycamore, and there, high in the top, was the coon. Grandpa threw a fit. He hopped around, whooping and hollering. He threw his old hat down on the ground and jumped up and down on it. Then he ran over and kissed little Ann right on the head. After we killed and skinned the coon, the judge said, "Well, let's walk back to that old fence. I think I know how that old fellow pulled his trick." Back at the fence, the judge stood and looked around for a few minutes. "Yep," he said, smiling. "That's how he did it." "How?" Grandpa asked. Still smiling, the judge said, "That old coon walked this rail fence. Coming even with a hackberry tree, he leaped up on its side and climbed up. Notice how thick the timber is around here? See that limb way up there in the top? The one that runs over and almost touches the sycamore?" We saw what he meant. The coon walked out on that limb, he said, leaped over, caught the sycamore limb. Repeating this over and over from tree to tree, he worked his way far out into the river bottoms. What I can't figure out is how that hound found him. Gazing at little Ann, he shook his head and said, "I've been hunting coons and judging coon hunts for 40 years, but I've never seen anything like that." He looked at me. "Well, son," he said, "you've tied the leading teams. There's only one more night of eliminations. Even if some of them get more than 3 coons, you'll still be in the runoff, and for what I've seen here tonight, you've got a good chance of winning the cup." I knew that Little Ann had scented the coon in the air, the same as she had the ghost coon. I walked over and knelt down by her side. The things I wanted to say to her I couldn't, for the knot in my throat, but I'm sure she understood. As we came into the campgrounds, hunters came out of their tents and gathered around us. The judge held up 3 big coon hinds, and there was a roar from the crowd. One man said, "That was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen." "What was a beautiful sight?" Grandpa asked. "Last night, those little red hounds brought that coon right through camp." The judge said, "We figured they did when we heard the noise." Laughing, the man said, "We heard them when they ran up the other side of the river. Way up above here, they crossed over. We could tell they were coming back, so we doused all the fires, and sure enough, they came right through camp. Those 2 little hounds weren't 50 yards behind the coon, running side by side. Boy, they were picking him up and laying him down, bawling every time their feet touched the ground. I tell you, it was the prettiest sight I ever saw." When the judge started telling about the last coon Little Ann had treed, I took my dogs over to our tent and fed them and watered them. After they had had their fill, I gave them a good rub down with a piece of gunny sack. Taking them out to the buggy, I tied them up. I watched while they twisted around in the hay, making their bed. That day, I tried to get some sleep in our tent, but the soaking Grandpa had taken in the river had given him a cold, causing him to snore. I never heard such a racket in all my life. I'd have sworn he'd rattled the paper sacks in our grocery boxes. Taking the blanket, I went out to my dogs. Little Ann had wiggled up as close as she could to old Dan. Prying them apart, I laid down between them and fell asleep. The last night of the eliminations turned out like the second night. None of the judges turned in more than 2 hides. That day, about noon, the owners of the other winning teams and I were called in for a conference with a head judge. He said, "Gentlemen, the eliminations are over. Only 3 sets of hounds are left for the runoff. The winner of tonight's hunt will receive the gold cup. If there's a tie for the championship, naturally there'll be another runoff." He shook the hands of each of us and wished us good luck. Tension began to build in the camp. Here and there hunters were standing in small groups talking. Others could be seen going in and out of tents with rolls of money in their hands. Grandpa was the busiest one of all. His voice could be heard all over the camp. Men were looking at me and talking in low tones. I strutted around like a turkey gobbler. That evening, while we were having supper, a hunter dropped by. He had a small box in his hand. Smiling, he said, "Everybody has agreed that we should have a jackpot for the winner. I've been picked to do the collecting." Grandpa said, "Well, you may as well leave it here right now." Looking at me, the hunter said, "Son, I think almost every man in this camp is hoping that you win it, but it's not going to be easy. You are going up against 4 of the finest hounds there are." Turning to my father, he said, "Did you know the 2 Walker hounds have won 4 gold cups?" Now, very seriously, Papa said, "You know I have 2 mules down at my place. One is almost as big as a barn. The other isn't much bigger than a jackrabbit, but that little mule can outpull the big one every time." Smiling, the hunter turned to leave. He said, "You could be right." Again, Papa asked me where I thought we should start hunting. "I've been thinking about that all day," I said. "You remember where we jumped that last coon in the swamp?" Papa said, "Yes." "Well, I figure more than 1 coon lives in that swamp. It's a good place for them, as there are lots of crawfish and minnows in those potholes. If a hound jumps one there, he's a good chance to tree him." "Why's that?" Papa asked. "It's a long way back to the river, and it's about the same distance to the mountains," I said. "Either way he runs, a dog can get pretty close to him, and so we would have to take to a tree." That evening we climbed into Grandpa's buggy and headed for the swamp. It was dark by the time we reached it. Grandpa handed Papa his gun, saying, "You're getting to be a pretty good shot with this thing." "I hope to get to shoot it a lot tonight," Papa said. Under my breath I said, "I do too." So after untying the ropes for my dogs, I held on to their collars for a minute. Pulling them up close, I knelt down and whispered, "This is the last night. I know you'll do your best." They seemed to understand, tugging at their collars. When I turned them loose, they started for the timber, and just as they reached the dark shadows, they stopped, turned around, and stared straight at me for an instant. The judge saw their strange actions, and laying a hand on my shoulders, he asked, "What did they say, son?" I said, "Nothing that anyone can understand, but I can feel that they know this hunt is important. They know it just as well as you or I." It was little Ann who found the trail. Before the echo of her sharp cry had died away, old Dan's deep voice floated out of the swamp. "Well, let's go," Papa said eagerly. "No, let's wait a minute." "Why wait?" Grandpa asked. "To see which way he's going to run," I said. The coon broke out of the swamp and headed for the river. Listening to my dogs, I could tell they were close to him. I said, "Pop, I don't think he'll ever make it to the river. They're right on his heels now." By the time we had circled the swamp, they were bawling treed. The judge said, "Boy, that was fast." I felt my father's hand on my shoulder, and looking at me, he smiled and nodded his head. Papa and I knew I had judged the coon perfectly. He didn't have time to reach the river or the mountains. My dogs had treed the coon in the tall ash which stood about 50 yards from the river. I knew the 50 yards had saved us a good hour, because he could have pulled a trick after trick if he'd gotten in the water. We spied the coon in the topmost branches. At the crack of the gun, he ran far out of the limb and jumped. He had landed in an old fallen treetop. He scooted through it. Coming out of the other side, he ran for the river. The tangled mass of limbs slowed my dogs, and they all but tore the treetop apart getting out of it. The coon was just one step ahead of them as they reached the river. We heard them hit the water. Running over, we stood and watched the fight. The coon was at home in the river. He crawled up on old Dan's head, trying to force him under. But before he could do it, little Ann reached up and pulled him off. In a scared voice, Papa said, "That water looks deep to me." "Maybe you better call him off," the judge said. "That's a big coon, and he could drown one of them as easily in that deep water." "Call him off," I said. "Why, you couldn't whip them off with a stick. There's no use for anyone to get scared. They know exactly what they're doing. I've seen this more times than one." Grandpa was scared and excited. He was jumping up and down, whooping and hollering. Papa raised the gun to aim. I jumped and grabbed his arms. "Don't do that," I yelled. "You're sure to hit one of my dogs." Round and round in the deep water the fight went on. The coon climbed on old Dan's head and sank his teeth into one of his long, tender ears. Old Dan bawled with pain. Little Ann swam in and caught one of the coon's hind legs in her mouth. She tried hard to pull him off. All three disappeared under the water. I held my breath. The water churned and boiled, and then all three came up at the same time. The coon was between the bank we were standing on and my dogs. He swam toward us. They caught him again just as he reached the shore. He fought his way free and ran for the large sycamore. Old Dan caught him just as he started up, and I knew that was the end of the fight. After it was all over, the coon and the coon had been skinned, Grandpa said, I hope we don't have to go through that again tonight. And for a while, I'm sure I thought your dogs were goners." The judge said, "Well, have you ever seen that? Look over there." Old Dan was standing perfectly still with his eyes closed and his head hanging down. Little Ann was licking at his cut and bleeding ears. "She always does that," I said. "If you'll watch, when she gets done with him, he'll do the same for her." We stood and watched until they had finished doctoring each other, and then trotting side by side, they disappeared into the darkness. We followed along, stopping now and then to listen.